Chapter 10. High Priest John stood on the balcony of his chamber. Amidst a sea of stars, the full moon sat high in the night sky. John shook off a chill and tied his white robe tighter. He overlooked the Capitol. Hundreds of lights could be seen from the lanterns burning on street posts and in shop windows. His gaze turned toward the king's palace. A long line of people were still waiting to receive their daily ration of food at the base of the steps. The king's generosity. The high priest put the pipe to his lips and inhaled. Smoke filled his lungs as the weed burned. Why did so many people do what they were told? He wondered. Why did they dress and act the way they did? Was it fate that they were born into that life and felt like there was no way out? They didn't want a way out, he surmised. People like to be guided, told what to do, controlled. It is mere fate that most people are born to be ruled. Only few, like himself, were the rulers. He was control. He was power. His body tensed as the thought almost overwhelmed him. He took another toke. "It's a grand view, isn't it?" a voice said from behind him. Jumping, John turned to see Victor. "Damn it, man!" he choked out, coughing from the smoke. Victor smiled as John regained his composure. "You scared the hell out of me," John said, running his hand over his gray, balding head. "Surely you have no hell in you, being the high priest and all," Victor said. "I am but a man," John Hoa said, holding his arms out. "The religious leader must be free of sin in the eyes of man," Victor replied, placing both his hands in the pockets of his black priest's robes. John snorted. "Then it is good that I am not seen so often," he said with a smile. "When did you return?" "A few hours ago," Victor said. John walked to his dresser. "And how did you fare in the independent cities?" he asked, putting the pipe away. "As you know, they are independent from the king," Victor began. "But they are still under the king's law," John interrupted. "And they reside in the kingdom." Victor inhaled and exhaled, annoyed. "Yes, and they still pay taxes to the king. But as I said, each independent city has their own laws and ways of doing things." He walked to stand in front of John. "I did, however, convince some influential people to join our cause." A grin replaced John's scowl. "Good, good. We need more converts, especially those with influence." He began to rummage through his drawer in a frantic manner. Victor painfully watched the man search for whatever it was he was searching for. John paused and looked up into his reflection into the mirror. "We should tax the people even harder. Drive the gap between the rich and the poor." "That won't work," Victor said. "Why not?" John snorted. "If you push people too hard, they will revolt, especially the people in the independent cities." "They will do as the king commands," John snapped. "They will do as God commands." "Look at the people," Victor said as he guided John to the balcony. Yells and cries could almost be heard from the balcony as a few of the people in line became hostile. "They are getting worse," Victor said, his arm on John's back. "And it only takes a spark to start a fire." Fighting broke out in the line as a few people broke formation. The palace guards began to break up the brawl. A few in the line stole food, taking advantage of the distraction and making a break for the safety of the streets. Victor looked at John, noticing the man's eyes narrow in contempt. Members of the order began arresting the criminals and troublemakers. No courtesy was shown as they marched them to the palace cells. Suddenly, the line changed shape. The mob scattered in an attempt to make a mad dash for the food. The guards and members of the order fell back and quickly began to call for help. "You see," Victor said, pointing, "this is just the beginning. For the most part, The people are complying with the king's generosity, but if you push harder, it will collapse around you," Victor said. John's breath was audible, his chest heaving as he watched. More of the order poured out of the palace to control the chaos. Within minutes, countless bodies were removed, conscious or not, and everything returned to normal. "If the independent cities unite against the king and the church, it will be our undoing," Victor said. John walked back into the room and began pacing back and forth. "What do I do?" he pleaded. "You're high priest," Victor said. "You have the power to do what you want." "I mean, what's the plan? How do we make the world see that the religion will save them?" John said. "It's no small task," Victor replied, his head down. "You're chief advisor. Help me," John cried. Victor paced for a moment. "I have an idea. That is, if you'll hear me out," he said. "Please, go on," John said. "It's a 3-step plan," Victor said as he took a step towards John. "First, my apprentice is going to murder hundreds of people tomorrow, here in the capital." John's face twisted in confusion. "What?" he gasped out. Victor took another step towards John. "Second, the king will be assassinated, and the order will be destroyed." John's jaw dropped. "This is madness. You can't be serious." John started to laugh. "Of course you're not serious." Victor smiled and took a step closer. "You almost had me going, though." John shook a finger at him. "Oh, I forgot. What's step 3? Victor stood in front of John. "Change of management," he said as he buried the curved dagger into John's sternum. John wheezed as blood trickled from the corner of his mouth. He slumped to grab hold of Victor's shoulder for support. Wide-eyed, he looked at Victor in disbelief. John began to weaken, and Victor helped him to lie down. Blood began to pool around John on the floor. John tried to speak, but all he could do was move his mouth. The pain of betrayal filled his eyes. Victor waited, silently, until John stopped moving. Victor pulled the dagger out and wiped the blood off on John's robe. Bringing the blade down hard, he smashed the dagger on the stone floor, causing a piece of the ruby to break off. He placed the chipped piece beside John, away from the blood. His heart racing, he walked to the dresser and poured himself a glass of wine. After his breathing returned to normal, he drank deep as he stared at the city. His gaze turned to the palace. It was all his now. Almost. Now it was up to Lucian. The king had to die, and with no connection to Victor. With King George alive, he would surely anoint someone else to be high priest, with or without the clergy's approval. The king was the one man Victor couldn't charm. His persistence actually hurt his rapport with the king. But with the king dead, the high priest would be given power over the kingdom in a time of crisis. Victor finished the glass of wine and walked back to John. He picked the dagger up and walked out of the chamber. He shut the door and made his way out of the church. "Almighty's blessing to you," he said, passing people as he made his way through the still crowded streets. Maybe he should have waited a bit longer, allowing time for everyone to return to their homes for the night. Turning down a dark alley, he left the busy street. Nobody followed him. A huge man emerged from the shadows. Victor handed him the dagger. "Keep it safe until tomorrow. I'll send someone to get it from you," he said. "What's happening tomorrow?" Karn said as Victor walked away. Victor stopped and turned his head to the side. "All hell is breaking loose."